All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a really complex story. It's about a spiritual guru who amassed a global following. But there are these incredibly serious allegations that his inner circle was less about enlightenment and more about control and abuse. So, yeah, we're going to dig into the decades of controversy surrounding Chris Butler and his Science of Identity Foundation. Okay, let's just start with a quote that cuts right to the heart of all this. According to former members, this is how Chris Butler allegedly referred to his followers. Now, critics argue this isn't just some stray comment. They see it as evidence of a really deep-seated contempt for the very people who had dedicated their entire lives to him. So that raises a pretty big question, right? How did a man who allegedly talked about his followers this way build a global spiritual movement in the first place? Well, to really understand the controversy, we first have to get a handle on who Chris Butler is and what he created. Okay, so Chris Butler, who's also known to his followers by his spiritual name Siddha Swarupananda, he came onto the scene back in the 1970s. He's a guru in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, which is a branch of Hinduism that's all about devotion to Krishna. He started this group, the Science of Identity Foundation, and on the surface, it just looks like a totally benign yoga and meditation group. But underneath that public image, he's attracted this really dedicated and now obviously very controversial global following.
Now, for any spiritual leader, their authority really comes from the tradition they claim to represent. And for Chris Butler's critics, this is exactly where the problems start. They allege that the entire foundation of his legitimacy is built on, well, broken sacred vows.
So to get how serious these allegations are, we have to understand this one key concept, the sannyasa vow. In this particular tradition, it is the highest spiritual commitment you can possibly make. It's a sacred, lifelong promise to live as a monk. That means renouncing all worldly attachments. We're talking no marriage, no sex, and absolutely no private wealth. And this right here is where that core conflict really comes into focus. On one side, you have the sacred vows of a monk. On the other, you've got the reality alleged by his critics, that Butler married one of his own students, that he accumulated millions in private wealth, and that he still used the revered titles of a renounced holy man. It's a direct contradiction of the vows he took. So this all brings up a really critical question. If these foundational vows were so clearly broken, like the critics allege, why on earth do people stay? Well, the answer, according to former members, moves way beyond just broken promises and into the realm of active psychological control. Former members, especially critics over in Poland, use this really chilling phrase to describe the culture inside the group, terror psychenshi, which means psychological terror. They allege it was an environment where verbal and mental intimidation were just constant tools of control. Accounts from people who've left are just filled with stories of these profanity-laced tirades from Butler. This alleged quote is a perfect example. It shows him just berating his disciples over a simple meal, and it really highlights this supposed disconnect between his spiritual role and this incredibly volatile behavior. And this alleged quote, it points to a pattern of public humiliation. Critics argue this wasn't just about anger. They say it was a deliberate technique to degrade and control his disciples, to foster this sense of worthlessness that made them completely dependent on his approval. And here we go again. Another alleged quote that critics use as evidence of a leader who saw himself as just fundamentally superior. The message wasn't spiritual guidance, it was belittlement. And that repeated use of profanity, like assholes, becomes this really disturbing theme in the stories from former followers. So, beyond the alleged verbal abuse, critics describe a really systematic structure of control, one they claim was designed to isolate followers and then exploit them for both their labor and their money. A key tactic, according to these sources, was controlling information. Followers were allegedly forbidden from reading traditional scriptures about the role of a guru or even from talking with Hindus outside their own little group. This basically created an echo chamber where Butler's authority was absolute, and just asking a question could get you kicked out. The allegations of exploitation also go deep into finances. Critics claim that followers were pressured to hand over everything, not just donations, but their businesses, their creative works, their properties. All of it allegedly flowed directly to Butler and his family, which helped build up their immense wealth. This all leads to a really powerful term used by the Polish critics, pańszczyzna, which basically translates to serfdom. They allege that for years, followers were used as a free labor force. They were building up properties and businesses that were eventually sold for a profit, and that profit, they say, went to the organization, not to the people who actually did all the work. Now, when you have decades of allegations this serious, they don't stay behind closed doors. This whole controversy has spilled out into the public, fueled by some high-profile political connections, and, as you'd expect, Butler's organization has mounted a very strong defense. One of the main reasons this story has gotten so much mainstream attention is Chris Butler's connection to political figures. Most famously, former U.S. Congresswoman and presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard has publicly identified him as her spiritual guide, her guru. So that political connection has definitely amplified the voices of the critics, but it's also become a huge part of the defense from Butler's supporters. They're asking a fundamental question. Is this a fair investigation into a leader's conduct, or is it actually a biased attack on a minority faith? The core defense from the Science of Identity Foundation really frames this entire controversy as religious bigotry. They argue that the critics are driven by Hinduphobia and that what we're seeing are malicious misinterpretations of their faith by outsiders who are just looking to target a prominent Hindu leader. And at the end of the day, that leaves us with the central question here. And honestly, it's not just in this story, is it? It's in any controversy involving a powerful spiritual group. When you have to weigh these heavy allegations of abuse against the defense of religious freedom, where is the line? Where is the line between faith and control, between a sacred tradition and what some call dangerous manipulation? That's the really difficult question this whole controversy asks all of us to consider.